All right, guys, we are here for our last discussion. This is our last lecture for the course. If you look at your syllabus, you'll notice that we're in Revelation this week, and then next week it has a TBD, to be determined. That was actually just intended right from the get-go to be an extra week. So this is our last official lecture week. Next week, we don't have anything at all planned, so you've got an extra week. Use that time to get caught up in the assignments that you need to do for this class, for other classes, whatever you need to do. But next week, we have nothing going on as far as lecture material, and then the week after, 2 weeks from this time, is finals week. That's when the final hermeneutics paper is to be turned in. Okay, but next week we got nothing going on, so use that time as you need to for your own self to get caught up. Okay, all right, we go out with a bang in this one. The Book of Revelation, similar to the Book of Acts, just like Acts is kind of its own unique biblical book, and therefore is treated as a separate biblical genre. Same kind of thing is happening with the Book of Revelation. It's quite unique, and therefore is treated as its own, with its own separate discussion for genre. Revelation is an intense book, as I'm sure most of you guys who've read it or had a look at it are aware of. It's a complex book. It's a debated book. How do we begin to understand a book like this? And while we're not going to be able to explain everything about Revelation, obviously, in a weak discussion of it here, we want to try and get a better foundation, a better approach to reading Revelation to help us in our own personal study of it. It was about 10 years ago, it was around about 2010, just to kind of give you a background to think about how different ways people approach Revelation. It was about 2010. I was going to grab lunch, and I got some lunch for a homeless guy, and we ended up striking up a conversation, and I could tell he was a believer of some sort, and he started to talk about kind of end time concerns, and he gave me this pamphlet, and it had some material in there, and he encouraged me to look it over. But one of the big things that stood out was at the very front of the pamphlet. It said, I wish I saved the pamphlet. I had it at one point, but I don't have it anymore. It said something to the effect of the end of the world and this big date in big bold letters, May 21st, 2011. And apparently, if you look through this pamphlet, it claims to have been able to estimate the time of the end of the world. It would be May 21st, 2011. So again, keep in mind, this is back when I'm reading this at 2010. So it was future at that point. But according to this pamphlet, 2010, May 21st, 2011 is when the end of the world is going to take place. This was coming fairly soon. How did it come to this conclusion? Well, interestingly, it claims to have investigated the Bible carefully, the scriptures carefully. It claims to have decoded its hidden messages, and through that process has discovered the precise date of God's final judgment on earth, the end of all things. As you could probably guess, not surprisingly, one of the books of the Bible that's used to determine this supposed precise date is this book right here, our Book of Revelation. Now, obviously, May 21st, 2011 has come and gone, and we're still here. So the approach was, the explanation, the decoding of the scriptures to find the end of the world date at May 21st, 2011 was obviously wrong. And maybe some of you have already come across similar experiences. You've heard different folks claim that on a certain date, the end of the world is going to take place, and it's using a kind of coding or decoding of biblical texts like Revelation to come to that conclusion. And yet these dates have been thrown out there and been shown wrong. So a couple things. Either we just haven't quite figured out the right code or decoding to put the exact end of the world time frame into place, or the whole approach altogether is just misguided. Is this the way to read a book like Revelation, as a book to be decoded, to work out, to figure out with some kind of precision the exact time of the end of the world, God's final judgment? It's definitely a key theme in Revelation, no doubt. But the question is that the best way to approach the book? Are we meant to read Revelation as pieces and bits of material to decode and to figure out a precise timeline and time frame to figure out when these things happen? Or is it something else? Is there a much more basic purpose to Revelation? And that's what we want to talk about. How do we understand Revelation? What's the best way to approach it? And how does its genre, how does its makeup help us get closer to putting these things in place? So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at Revelation. Okay, so first, in terms of the genre question, interestingly, Revelation is not put together by merely one genre. This is one big way in which it's a unique work. It's made up not of just one genre, but of three different types of genres. If you read Russell, you were presented with this idea. Revelation is made up of three different types of genre. Two of them you're already familiar with. So, for example, the epistle. This is what we covered last week. Revelation is the book of Revelation is in one part composed of the genre of epistle. How do we know this? Well, sorry. Oh, okay. Let me just list out the three different types of genre right here. So this is what Revelation is made up of. It's made up of part epistle, it's part prophecy, and part of what we call apocalypse, which we haven't seen yet. We'll come to that. So, okay, this is where we needed to go. In what sense is Revelation epistle? We see that in the book of Revelation itself, right from the very beginning. Revelation 1:4-6 shows signs of being an epistle. If you remember last week when we discussed the epistles, we said that one of the most identifiable features of an epistle, a letter, is a standard greeting. Well, this is what we see in Revelation. It's got a kind of greeting that makes it look like it's a letter. Right at the beginning of Revelation, we see this standard form of greeting. Okay, check out Revelation 1:4. It says, John, to the seven churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the seven spirits who are before his throne. And it continues on. It has all the features of a typical beginning of a letter. And so that's probably a good reason to see it as, in some sense, part epistle, part letter. This is, in one sense, a letter. And it's addressed to specific people. In this case, it's to seven churches that John wants his book of Revelation, his letter, in a sense, of Revelation, to be read by these different seven churches in Asia Minor. And he goes on to name them in the rest of Revelation. So that's one sense in which we can see that Revelation is a letter. It's got that standard letter greeting. And if you recall, when we talked about epistles last week, we said one of the main goals or reasons for a letter being written is to address an issue. Okay, we mentioned that the epistles, letters, are occasional writings. They're written with a specific purpose in mind. so if you remember, when we talked about like when Paul would write a letter to a church, it wasn't just a random letter that he decided to write. It was him finding out about things going on in the churches, maybe false beliefs that were creeping in, maybe sinful behaviors that were taking over. And he writes to address those issues. They're occasional letters in that sense. They're written on an occasional purpose for a specific occasion to address. Similar kind of thing we can see happening in Revelation. John is aware of what's going on in these 7 churches that he writes to, and he wants to address these issues. And so, in one sense, we see that Revelation is an epistle because he's writing to encourage and exhort believers in light of their present situations. Now, each of these 7 churches have different things going on, and you can see those in Revelation 2 through 3. That's kind of his Revelation 2 through 3 is the direct address to the churches and what's happening there. For the most part, it boils down to a couple things. Either they are falling into false behaviors or false beliefs, and John wants to correct them and warn them of the dangers if they continue in that direction. He finds that other churches are doing quite well. They've maintained their faith in Christ. They're not getting mixed up in any false beliefs or false behaviors, but they're being challenged by persecution. There are those from the outside who are persecuting them, and they're suffering as a result of their strong faith. And so John wants to encourage them and exhort them and press them on in their faith. So this is kind of what we see in Revelation. John is aware of what's happening in these churches. For those who are falling away and slipping away from faith in different ways, he wants to encourage them to stand strong. He wants to encourage them that the Lord is near, that he's going to bring judgment, final judgment, and you don't want to be on the bad receiving end of that. For those who are standing strong in their faith and being persecuted by their faith, same thing. He wants to encourage them to recognize that the Lord is near. He's coming in judgment. He's going to deal with sin and evil. He doesn't turn a blind eye to their suffering. He's there for them. So in a big way, whether there's problems going on or good things going on, the big encouragement is that the Lord sees and that he will take care of the problem of evil, which again, this is a big part of what Revelation is about, God's final judgment of evil and sin, and him bringing everything to a close and bringing in the new heavens, the new earth, the new creation of all things. These 7 churches are facing different hardships, and so John wants to write to encourage them, to exhort them to change if they need change, and to back that up by saying that the Lord God is in control. He's the righteous judge who's going to take care of all sin and all evil. So in that sense, we see that Revelation is in some sense an epistle addressed to 7 specific churches back in John's time for them to hear a specific message that they needed to hear, okay? But it's also, in some sense, prophetic writing. It's a form of prophecy. Now we covered prophecy as well. We looked at the prophetic writings, prophetic literature. In what sense do we see Revelation as a kind of prophetic work? Well, again, right from the very beginning, we see an indication that John understands his writing to be a kind of prophecy. He writes in Revelation 1:3, Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near. Okay, so again, he's identifying his work as, in some sense, a prophecy, a prophetic work. What did we say was key in reading the prophetic writings? Well, we mentioned that you want to have a careful distinction between these two ideas. The idea of prophecy as forthtelling and prophecy as foretelling. So now we mentioned when we went through the prophetic writings, we mentioned that the prophets are primarily forthtelling in their approach, and maybe secondarily so foretelling. That is, most of their message had to deal with what the people of Israel needed to hear right then and there in their situation, right? God was about to judge them right then and right there, and these prophets are largely just telling them what's going on right then and there so that they would change and act differently. It was maybe secondarily so foretelling, predicting future events, things that were going to take place down the road. There is some element of that in the prophetic writings, but that was kind of a secondary emphasis. The main emphasis in prophetic writings is to explain what needs to happen right then and there for God's people to get their act together. How about the book of Revelation? If it's prophecy, it's going to have also likely this combination of both a forthtelling aspect and a foretelling aspect. What's the balance in Revelation? Well, this is kind of one of the big, difficult questions that scholars wrestle with. How much of Revelation is dealing with what's happening for John's church then and there, a kind of forthtelling aspect, and how much of it is dealing with things beyond the time of John and his churches, looking to the future. Again, this is a difficult question that scholars wrestle with. We do sense that John is focused on both aspects in his book of Revelation. And we can see a hint of that in Revelation 1:19. So John receives a vision, and an angel comes and is helping him in writing this vision. This is kind of, if you see in that picture on the bottom right, this is kind of a picture of John getting a vision of the things that he's seeing and being told to write down. Okay, he's getting heavenly guidance as he's writing these things down. The angel tells him in Revelation 19, the Lord tells him, write the things which you have seen. Okay, John's seen a bunch of things in this vision. Okay, that's why it's called Revelation. He's being revealed these things. Write the things that you've seen. What kind of things has John seen? Well, this is kind of where it goes on. Write what you've seen, namely, in a sense, the things which are, and the things which shall take place after these things. Most scholars agree that this is kind of a helpful way of seeing that John's revelation deals with both things that were going on present to John and his church at his time, as well as things that were happening in maybe more of a futuristic frame of mind down the road. Okay, so John is told to write the things which are, the things that are the things that he's seeing, which correlate to what's happening during John's time and his church's time. So we see in a sense that there's a forthtelling aspect of his words. He's addressing things which are happening right then and right there for his church and his churches, and we saw some of that when we talked about the epistle aspect, the things that are happening, the good things that are happening, the bad things that are happening. But we also see John being told not just to write the things which are, but to write the things which are to take place after this. And this probably points to the futuristic aspects of John's writing, and shows, in a sense, the kind of foretelling aspect of his writings. But which things in Revelation relate to things in John's time and were present for his readers, and which things relate to things in the future? Okay, again, this is the big, difficult question that readers and scholars wrestle with, and there's not really a total agreement on this. This is the challenge in reading Revelation. So let's start to break some of this up a bit. There's 4 different major views in trying to piece together what parts of Revelation are were present for John and his readers, and what parts are future for John and his readers and may come to expression in our time or maybe even beyond our time. So one view, and Russell briefly discusses these in his book, but one view is the historicist approach, and in this view, Revelation is seen as describing events which are constantly unfolding throughout church history. Now, this is the least held approach among scholars today. And again, guys, don't. This is kind of just to help you get some kind of background in some of this stuff. Don't get too hung up on trying to make perfect sense of this. This is just a preview, in a sense, an introduction into these kind of discussions. Again, Revelation's complex, but this is just to help you get an idea of some of the things that go into the discussion of Revelation. But don't worry about getting too hung up with figuring all of this stuff out, okay? This is just to give you an introduction. So again, one view, the historicist approach, sees Revelation describing events constantly unfolding throughout church history. So this was, in a sense, the pamphlet approach that I was given. It looked at the different symbols and language in Revelation. It decoded it and attempted to peg the different things in Revelation down to specific events in history, and specifically in church history. Most scholars don't take this approach. It's kind of a flawed approach. It kind of looks at Revelation through the wrong kind of lens. Revelation is probably not meant to be seen as language that depicts very specific, identifiable, markable events in church history that can be pegged with precision, which is what this approach often tends to do. So, for example, in Revelation, John describes the openings of 7 seals. He describes blowing of 7 trumpets. He describes pouring out of 7 bowls. And these seem to be connected to acts of judgment in Revelation. What do these things represent? Well, in the historicist approach, they try to peg them down to specific events in church history. So at one period in church history, the 7 seals being opened fulfilled that period. For another event in church history down the road, the 4 trumpets and the judgments represented there represented another period in church history, and so on and so forth, if you get the idea. From the time that Jesus ascended into heaven to our present time, this approach tries to see Revelation as events being unfolded in church history. The problem with this approach is that there's very little agreement on what represents what. So, for example, the beast, the Antichrist figure in Revelation. Who is he? What is he all about? Well, different folks have said different things. At one point, the Antichrist, the beast, was said to be the Pope in church history, in I believe like the 1600s. The Pope was thought to be the Antichrist. Later on, a figure like Hitler arises, and definitely a bad dude, but people thought that he was the Antichrist. Maybe not, after all, after considerable time has passed and we're still here. Some have thought that other contemporary key figures like President Obama, was the Antichrist. So you see kind of my point here is these different ideas and connections are thrown out there, but is this even the right approach? A bad pope has come and gone. Hitler has come and gone. And yet these don't seem to be, if they are, they don't seem to be the Antichrist, the beast represented in Revelation, which kind of begs the question, is this even the right way to interpret Revelation by pegging the details in Revelation to specific historical events. Again, most scholars tend not to take this approach. They don't think this is the best way to see it. So that's one approach, and it's not the most favorite approach among experts. Number two, it's called the preterist approach. Okay, according to this view, those who take this view understand Revelation to be describing events which have already all entirely been fulfilled in the past. So again, this puts a heavy emphasis. We mentioned that in prophetic writings, the heavy emphasis is on forthtelling, where the prophet is explaining things happening in his time, in the here and the now for him. This is kind of, in a sense, the approach for the prophetic elements in Revelation. These scholars see John as largely describing for his church, for his audience, for his original readers, things that were happening right then and right there in their time. And they've already been fulfilled in John's original audience's time. So that for us, it would have been present for them, but it's now past for us. These things have already happened. So, for example, they would see the bowl judgments, the seals judgments, the trumpet judgments, the bowl judgments. Those would have been tribulations and difficulties that already took place in the time of John's readers. When he mentions in his 7 letters to the churches, when he mentions, "Hey, I'm aware, I know that some of you guys are being persecuted and suffering for your faith." The implication is that some of these these judgments that are mentioned in Revelation are to respond to and be the kind of judgment against those who were persecuting the church back then. The Antichrist would have been seen as the Roman emperor back in John's day and his church's day. He would have been seen as the Antichrist figure. And so basically the idea is what John is writing about in Revelation is most directly applied to his readers. The bowl judgments, the 7 different kinds of judgments directly apply to his readers. The Antichrist was a leading evil figure in John's readers' time, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the idea is Revelation largely describes things that happened back in John's time. Oh, and they also saw the church's persecutors were largely those from the Jewish world who didn't believe that Jesus was Messiah, was Christ, and are continuing to persecute Christians, and also those from the larger Roman world who didn't believe that Christians were right at all in their beliefs, and they persecuted Christians for their own faith. According to this view, the judgment that takes place on the Christians' persecutors had 2 forms. It was against the Jews when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, and it was against the Roman Empire when the Roman emperor when the empire fell in the 4th century. So again, it's in that sense that those who take this approach see Revelation as already having been fulfilled. The judgment that was meant to take place against the persecutors of Christians, both from antagonistic Jews and from the larger Gentile world, those already took place in key events in the past. So how do we assess this approach? Well, I mean, in one sense, the benefit of this approach is that I think it does rightly, in some sense, see some relevance for John's original readers. Again, he's writing, in one sense, an epistle to 7 churches who need to hear right then and there what God wants to say to them. So the one benefit, one positive of this approach is I think it does, in some sense, rightly try to relate at least some concerns in Revelation to what John's original church and original audience needed to hear. They were suffering, they were being persecuted, they were needing to be encouraged that God is in control and he's going to deal with injustice. And this is partly what they needed to hear, and was relatable to them. And so some of the things that were happening in Revelation, some of the symbolic language may have been directly applicable to them. God was in some sense already taking care of their persecutors in some fashion. But does it completely describe everything that's taken place for John and his original readers? Maybe not so much. Especially the very end of Revelation, which describes an arrival of the new heavens and the new earth, when everything is made right, when all sin is destroyed, all evil is destroyed, and God establishes his perfect creation, his perfect reign again. We definitely haven't seen that happen. John's churches didn't see that happen. That seems clearly to be a future event for John and his readers, and even for us. We're not even there yet. So there may be some issues with this approach as well. It rightly sees, I would say, rightly emphasizes that there are some things in Revelation that John was specifically addressing to his churches and to his audience, and that had relevance for them. But maybe not so much to the effect that everything that happens in Revelation has already happened. Okay. The third approach, the futurist approach. If the one view says that everything in Revelation has already happened, is in the past, this approach says that most of what's described in Revelation relates to things that are still largely yet to be fulfilled, still haven't quite happened yet. Yeah. So while there are some things that definitely would relate to what the seven churches that John writes to are experiencing and need to be encouraged by, there are some things that probably we would have to say his audience, his church, did not directly face and see come to fulfillment in their time. So things like the rising of an Antichrist figure, while there might have been some image of that in maybe the Roman emperor at the time, he's clearly not the ultimate earthly bad guy. He's come and gone, and we're still here. So this Antichrist figure, this beast-like figure, is probably still someone or something that's yet to arise and really pose a great threat to God's people and God's establishment, and the very thing that God's going to ultimately overthrow. Again, we haven't seen the new heavens and the new earth come yet, so that's clearly in the future. The judgments, the bowl, the seal, the trumpet judgments, these are probably also something yet to be seen poured out according to this view. So here's another view that says, so far the things that we've seen in Revelation are largely maybe yet to be experienced. We haven't seen anything with quite the same intensity that we've seen in the judgments. We haven't seen any figure with quite the intensity that's described for the Antichrist figure, the beast. And we clearly haven't seen the new heavens and new earth. So maybe a lot of what's being relayed in Revelation does have a largely futuristic aspect to it. It's largely yet to be fulfilled. Okay, so that's another view. And then the last view, the fourth view, takes a slightly different approach from these other views. The allegorical approach, in which Revelation is said to depict more of a kind of symbolic, constant spiritual battle between good and evil. So this approach is very, very different than the other approaches. The other approaches, 1, 2, and 3, try to take seriously that Revelation is talking about some kind of events in some fashion, whether they happened in the past for John or whether they're still yet to be fulfilled. This approach says, no, that's not the right way to approach it at all. That Revelation is not talking about specific events that are going to happen, but that it's really mainly just a symbolic kind of storyline of this kind of ongoing battle between good and evil. So that, for example, the bowl judgments, the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, they don't represent actual events in history, whether they were in the past or whether they're yet to come, but that they just kind of represent overall God's response to evil. God judges evil, right? Well, these different acts of judgment, the seal judgment, the trumpet judgment, the bowl judgment, they're just kind of symbolic ways of God showing how he responds to evil, namely he judges it. And so they represent, in a sense, God's symbolic judgment on sinners for all times. Similarly, the Antichrist figure, rather than looking at him or it as some identifiable thing or person in history, this view takes the Antichrist as just symbolic of any and all who stand opposed to God. So in this view, Hitler could be an Antichrist-like figure. A corrupt pope can be an Antichrist-like figure. All these guys can be representative, symbolic of Revelation's kind of Antichrist. But in this view, according to this view, it doesn't point to any one concrete figure or being. It's just representative. But it's probably the case that the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction in this view. This view kind of tends to be a little bit too loose with the symbolic language. Anything and everything can almost represent the things that are talked about in Revelation. But, I mean, yes, while it might be difficult to peg down the things that Revelation's pointing to, it's probably not meant to be so loose that it can apply to anything and everything. There's probably some sense in which it's right to see these things pointing to actual things that are to take place. So this approach can maybe be a little bit too loose with some of the language. We definitely want to say that when God establishes his new heaven and new earth, that's an identifiable thing that we can say is going to take place. It's not meant to be representative of all the times that God brings goodness out of evil. While that's true, while God does do that, while he brings goodness out of evil, we want to say that there's going to be an ultimate final sense in which that's true, when all evil and all sin is destroyed. When Revelation depicts that at the very end, we want to say, yes, there's going to be a specific time that takes place, and we haven't gotten there yet, and we don't want to be too loose and symbolic about those kind of descriptions. Okay, I said a mouthful there, and again, these are some of the more complex deals in Revelation. I understand if this is a bit complex and over your heads a bit. Don't worry too much about that. Get the general ideas here on these points, okay? Just understand that there's 4 different ways that scholars look at how much the things in Revelation relate to specific historical events. There's 4 different views. There's some measure of disagreement between them. It's a complex issue. That's kind of the main thing to take away here. And so if even scholars are debating these things, then we need to also ourselves have a measure of caution in reading Revelation and attempting to be precise about the language pointing to this or that thing. We just want to show a little bit of caution. We want to make sure we're doing good, careful study as we're reading a book like Revelation. Okay, let's go on here. Okay, so Revelation is in one part epistle. It's in one sense prophecy, as we've talked about some of the what parts of Revelation is present and what parts of Revelation is more futuristic and the complications there. And then there's this element here. Revelation is also what's called apocalypse. This is its own distinct genre. Apocalypse literally means revelation. Okay? It's a revealing. But this revealing is kind of categorized as its own specific genre. And this is probably the most important and most misunderstood element of Revelation is its apocalyptic nature. What is apocalypse? Well, we get some sense of what the genre apocalypse is like by looking at other ancient writings back in the time that were also considered apocalypses that had similar elements that we see in Revelation, in the book of Revelation. So what do we see when we look at other apocalyptic books and we look at the book of Revelation? What are some similarities that go on between them that help us get a better understanding of what Revelation is as apocalypse? Well, let's talk about that. So one thing that's common among apocalyptic works like Revelation is the writing tends to arise out of a time of persecution. Most apocalyptic works are written because of the response to a time of intense persecution. Okay? We mentioned when we talked about Revelation as, in some sense, an epistle, I mentioned that John is writing to these churches in some respects because they're being persecuted. There's a measure of persecution happening at this time. This is often the occasion, a reason that an apocalypse is written. It's meant to address a time of intense persecution. And this is what we see in Revelation as well. Okay, most apocalypses often describe God's climactic end of the world judgment and salvation. Okay, the divine message that's given is that God will one day break into human history. He sees the persecution taking place, and he assures his church that he's going to break into human history and bring final victory for God's people, for the righteous, and final judgment for the wicked, for those who've rebelled against God. As much as the righteous are called to be light and salt in a fallen world, they can't bring about the kind of change that in the world that will lead to perfection. God has to step in to accomplish this, and this is what apocalyptic literature envisions. So how will the end come about? Well, it's not going to come about by God's people. It's not going to come about on God's people's end. It's going to be God stepping in and doing something. This is what most apocalypse writings emphasize. There will be a time when God will step in, and he will bring about final judgment and final salvation for his people. This is what Revelation clearly emphasizes. It's not God's people finally doing something different that brings about God's change. It's God himself. He steps in, he addresses the persecution, the evil taking place in the world, and he steps in and judges evil and brings about final salvation. Okay, this is typical of apocalyptic writings. Another big one, and this is where we often get stumped. Okay, Revelation is saturated with elaborate visions and symbolism. It's all over Revelation, right? This is what apocalyptic works also look like. They also make use of a lot of symbolism and visionary elements. Okay, this is just kind of the stuff of apocalyptic literature. This is very unfamiliar for us. This if it's anything that stumps us most in reading Revelation, this is definitely it. But this is a big part of what's characteristic of apocalyptic writings. Most of this language would have probably been familiar with John's original readers. Okay, they would have seen the significance in the visions and the symbolism, but we're the ones that have a little bit of difficulty here because we're so far removed from the history and the context of this time, and so we need a little bit of help here. This is where especially good, careful study is helpful in this sense. Okay, how do we begin to understand some of the language here? Well, While there's no real simple solution for understanding all the visions and the symbolism in Revelation, we can start to get some kind of sense to help us out here. Here's two important things to keep in mind when looking at the symbolism and the imagery in Revelation. One is the background of the image. Okay, often a lot of times the language that John is using, the symbolism he uses, the symbolism that's coming forth in Revelation, there's a background to it. It usually relates to something we've seen somewhere else, or at least the symbolism can do that kind of thing. I'll give you an example. In Revelation 10, 9 through 11, John is told to consume a scroll. And the angel tells him, when you eat the scroll, it will be both bittersweet to you. And John, affirms that. He eats a scroll and it's bittersweet to him. What's going on here? What does that mean? What's the significance of this? It looks kind of odd. John eating a scroll and it having this effect on him. Well, the careful reader, if they know their Old Testament, they hear bittersweet scroll and they think, oh, wait a minute, that sounds kind of familiar. And it should. And it's because in another work, a prophetic work, interestingly enough, in Ezekiel, he is similarly given a scroll to eat. And when he eats it, it has the same effect. It's both bitter and sweet. And it's very clear from the context that it has this dual effect because of two things. It's in one sense sweet because it's God's word. The scroll that he eats, in a sense, is symbolic of him consuming the message that he's been told to give and give it to others. Okay, so that in a sense, God's message now becomes Ezekiel the prophet's message. And it's sweet because, again, it's exactly what God has wanted Ezekiel to say. It's God's word, which is a good thing. But it's also, in a sense, bitter because in it, there's a message of judgment. And so if God's people don't heed the judgment, it's going to have its bitter effect. It's going to be a negative effect. Well, this probably helps us see the correlation in Revelation. That is, when John is similarly given the scroll to eat, which is bittersweet to him, it has the same kind of significance. It's bittersweet to him because his message is both good in the sense that it's God's word and there's a message of hope in there, but it's also bitter because there's lots of judgment that comes about from the message. God's going to judge those who continue to oppose him. So what may look weird at first to us, this idea of John consuming a bittersweet scroll, we can start to get maybe a better sense of the symbolism behind it if we know some other background information. And in this case, the background comes directly from another Old Testament book. Okay, so we can get help by knowing the background of the image. We can get some help by paying attention to John himself and whether or not he specifies the significance of the image. With some images, John very specifically identifies what it is he's referring to. In other cases, there's a much more general referent. So, for example, Revelation 12:9, John very directly says, calls this dragon that he sees in his vision Satan. He very directly identifies the dragon as Satan, so that any time now that we see the dragon mentioned in Revelation, we're reminded, oh yeah, John's made very clear who and what this image is. It's an image of Satan. In other instances, though, it can be a little bit challenging. And again, we want to show a measure of caution here. So in Revelation 6:1 through 8, John sees a vision of, he calls them 4 horsemen that come out riding, and they're of different colors. He sees a pale horse, a red horse, a black horse, and they seem to be connected to different catastrophes. So one is represented by conquest, one is represented by famine, one is represented by death, and so on. What do these signify? Are these actual events that are going to take place? Is there going to be a period in church history where we see an intense period of famine? Is there going to be an intense period of death? Or is this just kind of more generally meant to be understood? Do these four horsemen not represent periods in history where these specific things will happen, but is this just kind of generally a representation of the kinds of different ways that God brings on these general disasters as kind of forms of judgment on the world? It's difficult. John doesn't very specifically identify this image like he does with the dragon being Satan. So in this case, we want to show a little bit more hesitation, a little more caution about whether or not we identify it with a specific event or whether we speak about it more generically, more generally. Okay, the important point in all this is that the language, the figurative language, must be handled with a lot of care. Not everything is to be taken too literally, and not everything is to be taken too loosely. In each instance, we want to study them and consider them carefully. And where are we going to get the best help in this? Commentaries, okay? Commentaries are good places to help us sort through making sense of the intense language, the symbolic language that we see in Revelation. Okay, we've said a lot there. All right. Again, Revelation is a tough book. It's a complex book, but I'd like to think that if we begin to understand a little bit more about its elements, we get a better sense of how to approach the book of Revelation. Okay, so let's talk about some principles for reading Revelation now that we've seen a bit of what Revelation is all about. Number one, let's keep our emphasis where it's meant to be kept. Okay, Christians are primarily called, as they read Revelation, they're primarily called to persevere to the end, as opposed to not to peg down everything that we see in Revelation to specific events. That's not our main goal in reading Revelation. That's the temptation. We're tempted to piece together all the symbolism to figure out how it all happens, how the end comes about. But that's not the primary goal in reading Revelation. Okay? The primary message of Revelation is, yes, Christians face suffering. Yes, Christians face persecution. God's message of Revelation is he sees it, he's aware of it, and he has a plan to deal with evil. He doesn't turn a blind eye to it. He's going to one day put an end to all evil and bring about his perfect kingdom. Therefore, what's our task? What's our goal? Not to figure out how it all takes place. Our task, our goal, is to stand strong, to persevere to the end, to know that God doesn't turn a blind eye to our suffering. It's going to be tough. Our faith is always tested and challenged. But what's the response? Not to give up, not to lose heart, not to throw in the towel, but to see the message that God is giving in Revelation, that he's going to deal with sin, he's going to deal with evil, and therefore we can stand strong and persevere. That's the overall message of Revelation. So whatever we're reading in Revelation, we want it to come through this filter, that it's ultimately a message about how we're called to stand strong and to persevere to the end. That's the main point, the main message in reading Revelation. Number two, we best want, with all the intense symbolism, with the question of how much of it is in the past, how much is in the future, and the challenges there, we want to ultimately say that Revelation is a realistic picture of the end. It does show us that God will indeed deal with sin and evil, and that he will indeed bring about his final kingdom in all its glory with no sin, no evil, and we'll be a part of that. Yet it's a symbolic picture of this whole process. And we want to show great care in dealing with the symbolism. The best way to know how to work with the symbolism is to have some good, helpful resources. This is, again, where commentaries and background study sources become so helpful. Okay, so good idea to use these in helping us sort through the symbolism. And lastly, We can get better help in reading Revelation if we've got a better understanding of the Old Testament, because a lot of John's language, a lot of his symbolism relates to Old Testament ideas. If we read the Old Testament with more care, with more sensitivity, we'll be able to more carefully read and understand the book of Revelation. So the more we can get into God's word in the Old Testament, the more we'll be better equipped to understand Revelation, because Revelation is hugely reliant on things, language, visions, symbolism that's already present in the Old Testament as well. Okay, that's Revelation for you. A complex book, a challenging book, but again, keep your eyes on the most important things here. All right. Normally I would just cut the video here and we would go to a bit of a break for our next segment. But I'm going to go straight into it here because it's going to be fairly brief. Okay. Worship. You did some reading on this either in Foster or Whitney, and they covered different aspects of worship as relates to our approach before God. For example, in coming to a church gathering and the different ways that we can worship in song, the different ways that we can worship in being gathered together as a community. They touched on other things as well, but here's what I kind of want to focus on. What's our passage there? Romans 12:1. Okay, this is the passage that we looked at earlier this semester. Romans 12:1, Paul says, in view of God's mercies, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice to God. And he equates this, he says, this is your spiritual act of worship. What is worship in that sense? It's the offering of our own selves. Our own bodies can be a form of a sacrifice of worship to God. When we give our own selves, our own bodies, and the things that we do as a way of wanting to please God, that itself can be an act of worship. I want you to look back on these things that we've covered as we looked at the spiritual disciplines. Silence and solitude, prayer, fasting, simplicity and stewardship, service, confession, celebration, all of these were different acts that we focused on, different disciplines that we can encourage each other with. And they themselves are forms of worship. When you engage in silence and solitude, when you set aside that time for God, you were engaging in worship. When you focused on constant prayer to God for a period of time, you were engaged in worship. You were using your body in worship to God. Same thing with fasting. When you set aside a period of time when you chose not to focus on food, but focus more on your time with the Lord, you were engaging in worship of God. All of these spiritual disciplines that we've gone through have been different forms, practices of giving our bodies in spiritual service and worship to God. Now, ideally, if we were in class, we would have come together and spent some time encouraging each other with these different experiences and which ones were kind of the most impactful for you as you connected to the Lord. Obviously, we're not able to do that this time because we're not meeting in class together. But this is kind of your challenge for this assignment. You've all been, as you've been carrying out these practices, you've all been engaging in worship to God, worship with your bodies, and with your spirit, obviously, too. Your whole body and spirit in giving yourself to the Lord in these ways has been an act of worship. Spend some time thinking about these practices. In what ways did you see yourself growing in your worship of God, in your practice of these things? In what ways maybe do you see opportunities for growth, some challenges? Which of these were maybe a bit more difficult to engage as an act of worship to God, and maybe might be an opportunity to grow more in? Okay, this is kind of what we want to look at when we look at reflecting on our worship of God. Go back to your disciplines, your exercising disciplines, and where did you see strength? Where did you see opportunities for growth? In what ways did you see yourself doing these things as Paul says, giving your bodies over in acts of worship to God? So this is what you want to do for the worship reflections. There's instructions on Canvas. Follow those for the last assignment on worship. We got the last either genre paper or a BIP paper on Revelation, a genre paper on Revelation if you're to sign up for that, or a BIP on Revelation 5 if you're doing your BIP in Revelation 5. Okay, and again, these are going to be due on Saturdays now. So for this one, obviously not this upcoming Saturday, but the next Saturday. All right, guys, again, this brings us to our conclusion for our time together. If you have any questions, I'm still always available through email, so please make sure you email me if you have any concerns you need to address. All right, I'll talk to you guys later.